we first met, before we did the pilot, I said she was 12 years younger than I. She had never done comedy. She, within no time at all, became as good a comedian as I've ever worked with. She was just sensational.
He's hit
At 100, Dick Van Dyke still can't stop talking about Mary Tyler Moore. He just turned 100 years old. He's outlived nearly everyone from his generation. And yet, when you ask Dick Van Dyke about the best years of his life, he doesn't talk about Hollywood premieres or award shows. He talks about a young actress he met in 1961, a woman named Mary Tyler Moore, and a chemistry so strong that decades later, he still hasn't stopped bringing her up. So what actually happened between them, and why does her name keep surfacing at every single milestone of his life, even now? In 1961, Mary Tyler Moore was a young, largely unknown actress walking into an audition room to read opposite an already rising comedian named Dick Van Dyke. Neither of them could have predicted what came next. The Dick Van Dyke Show premiered that year on CBS and ran through 1966, and it turned both of them into two of the most recognizable faces on American television. Van Dyke played Rob Petrie, a comedy writer with a talent for physical humor and a habit of tripping over his own living room ottoman. Moore played Laura Petrie, his wife, a role that reshaped how women were portrayed on television sitcoms and made capri pants a fashion statement that's still referenced today. Together, they didn't just perform a marriage. They made audiences believe in one. That believability set the show apart. In an era when TV families often felt stiff and overly polished, Rob and Laura Petrie felt like a real couple, people who cheesed each other, argued in small, ordinary ways, and clearly adored one another. Viewers weren't just tuning in for jokes. They were watching two people who seemed to genuinely understand each other, which only made their on-screen connection more convincing. That kind of chemistry rarely happens on command. Anyone who has spent long hours on a set knows that pretending to be married to someone, day after day, for years at a time, can blur lines that were never meant to blur. Inside jokes start to feel real. Timing becomes instinct. And for Van Dyke and Moore, something clearly clicked that went beyond the script, something he has spoken about openly more than once over the decades. Here's what tends to get lost in headlines that frame this as some kind of shocking, decades-buried confession. This was never a secret Van Dyke sat on for 60 years. He has talked about his feelings for Moore in interviews and in his own writing going back a long way, well before recent headlines started treating it like a deathbed revelation. Van Dyke has spent much of his life being candid about his career, his struggles, and the people who shaped him. So the real question isn't what he finally admitted. It's why this particular story keeps circling back into the news, decade after decade, as if it's brand new. Here's the part of the story people tend to enjoy most, and it holds up even without any exaggeration. Van Dyke has openly acknowledged that he developed a crush on Moore while the two of them were filming the show together. Not a secret relationship. Not a scandal. A crush, the kind you might expect from two people who spent years standing inches apart pretending to be desperately in love, 5 days a week, in front of a live studio audience. By his own account, the two of them would fall into fits of laughter around each other on set, laughter that became enough of a recurring issue that it slowed down filming. Directors likely appreciated the chemistry it produced on screen while quietly dreading what it meant for the shooting schedule. If you've ever worked closely with someone you were a little too fond of, that kind of nervous, can't hold a straight face energy probably sounds familiar. Van Dyke has also shared a smaller, almost funny detail from that period. At some point, a psychiatrist essentially pointed out what should have been obvious to everyone around him, that he had feelings for his co-star. Sometimes it takes an outside observer to say the thing everyone else has already noticed. It's a small anecdote, but it says a lot about how real those feelings actually were, even if neither of them fully admitted it to themselves at the time. Here's the detail that reframes the entire story. For most of the years they spent playing husband and wife on television, both Van Dyke and Moore were married to other people. That fact isn't a footnote on the way to the more interesting part. It's the center of the whole story. Van Dyke has been clear about this. Whatever existed between him and Moore never crossed into an actual affair. No secret relationship behind the scenes.
No hidden meetings.
Just two people who liked each other, quite possibly more than either expected when they first met in that audition room, and who chose consistently not to act on it. That's arguably a more compelling story than a hidden romance would be. Celebrity gossip usually trades in scandal, in betrayal, in somebody eventually getting hurt. This is the opposite. Two professional adults navigated a genuine attraction while staying loyal to the people they had already committed their lives to. Considering how much public and industry scrutiny surrounded the stars of a hit network show, the fact that this never became a scandal says something about the restraint both of them showed. There is no reliable evidence of a physical relationship between them, regardless of how often recycled headlines try to suggest otherwise. What existed was a mutual attraction that both of them acknowledged publicly at different points, and both consciously chose not to pursue. 5 years of manufactured on-screen intimacy is more pressure than plenty of real relationships have started under. The fact that theirs didn't become one is exactly why this story has aged well instead of curdling into tabloid wreckage. Mary Tyler Moore herself spoke about their connection before she passed away, describing the chemistry between them in terms that closely matched Van Dyke's own account. She also confirmed, just as directly as he did, that nothing physical ever happened between them. Two people telling matching versions of the same story, across separate interviews, separated by years, without any apparent coordination. That kind of consistency is about as close to a verified account as these stories tend to get. For millions of viewers, Rob and Laura Petrie didn't just resemble a married couple. They felt like one. That illusion is exactly why people have spent decades wondering whether something more had to be happening once the camera stopped. Their timing on screen was almost telepathic. They seemed to anticipate each other's reactions before a line even landed, and neither one ever looked like they were straining for a laugh. That kind of ease is difficult to fake, even for skilled performers, which is part of why audiences kept assuming there had to be a real romance somewhere underneath it. Much of that came down to trust. Van Dyke has often praised Moore's instincts, noting that she always seemed to know exactly how to elevate a scene without pulling focus from anyone else. She could match his physical comedy step for step, then ground the moment with real warmth. In turn, he gave her room to experiment. They weren't competing for laughs. They were building them together, and audiences could feel it every week. Looking back, it's easy to see why people confused that chemistry with romance. But some of the strongest on-screen partnerships in television history were never built on secret relationships at all. They were built on mutual respect and years of learning exactly how the other person thinks. That's what Rob and Laura Petrie became for viewers, not because of any hidden scandal, but because two genuinely gifted performers trusted each other completely. That trust didn't disappear when the series ended in 1966. If anything, it became the foundation for a friendship that lasted the rest of Mary Tyler Moore's life, which says a great deal about what they actually built together. Mary Tyler Moore passed away in 2017, and Dick Van Dyke did not stay quiet about it. He spoke publicly and openly about what she meant to him, both personally and professionally, describing their friendship and her legacy in television in the kind of terms you'd expect from someone talking about a lifelong friend, not a colleague from more than 50 years earlier. He praised her comic timing specifically, something anyone who has watched even a single episode of the show can understand immediately. Moore had a gift for landing a joke with nothing more than a glance or a perfectly placed pause, and Van Dyke, who had spent years standing next to her doing exactly that kind of work, understood better than almost anyone how rare that ability actually was. This wasn't a rehearsed tribute read off a card. It was a man in his 90s speaking, unprompted, about someone he had cared about, in whatever complicated way that word applies, for more than half a century. The crush from 1961 hadn't faded into some vague memory. It had matured into real grief for a friend he had known for most of his adult life. Dick Van Dyke turned 100 years old on December 13, 2025, and the milestone brought a wave of new interviews and tributes, along with a book reflecting on his life and career. Once again, Mary Tyler Moore's name kept surfacing throughout the coverage, because it is genuinely difficult to tell the story of his career without her standing right there in the middle of it. In interviews around his 100th birthday, Van Dyke reflected on his life with the same candor he's always shown, joking about his age, crediting his wife Arlene Silver for keeping him active, and looking back on a career that includes multiple Emmys, a Tony, and a Grammy. He also holds the distinction of being one of the oldest daytime Emmy winners in the awards history, a fact that says a lot about a man who has simply never stopped working. But ask anyone what defined that career. Ask any longtime fan or entertainment journalist covering his 100th birthday, and the Dick Van Dyke Show comes up almost immediately. And so does she. That's really the heart of this whole story. There was never a moment where Dick Van Dyke suddenly broke his silence about Mary Tyler Moore, because he was never actually silent about her in the first place. He's talked about the crush. He's talked about the laughter that used to derail entire takes. He's talked about her talent and their friendship consistently, from right after her passing all the way through his 100th birthday celebrations. What's happening now isn't a secret finally coming out. It's a man 100 years old, still choosing to honor someone who shaped some of the best years of his career, every time he gets the chance to talk about her. There's something almost old-fashioned about the story, and it says a lot about the era Van Dyke and Moore came up in. This was the early 1960s. Television was still a young medium, and the industry itself was far smaller and more tightly knit than it is today. There was less distance between people's personal and professional lives, which meant less room to hide anything, even if either of them had wanted to. They weren't operating in some quiet corner of a massive industry. They were the two biggest names on one of the most watched shows in the country, surrounded by crew members, producers, and a live studio audience every single week. If something had actually happened between them, the odds of it staying hidden for 60 years, through interviews after Moore's passing and now through Van Dyke's own 100th birthday coverage, would be close to impossible. Secrets that large rarely survive that kind of scrutiny for 6 decades. A small, honestly acknowledged crush, on the other hand, can, because there was never anything to actually hide. What this really shows is a kind of restraint that doesn't come up often anymore. Two people felt something real for each other in the middle of a job that required them to simulate romance for a national audience every week, and they chose their marriages instead. Not because no one would have noticed, because it mattered to both of them to make that choice. The Dick Van Dyke Show is still widely regarded as one of the sharpest, most influential sitcoms of its era, praised for its writing, its physical comedy, and for treating its characters like real people instead of punchlines. It set a template that countless family and workplace comedies borrowed from for decades afterward, and much of that template rested on how believable Rob and Laura Petrie felt as a couple. Moore used the role of Laura Petrie as a launching pad into one of the most significant careers in television history, eventually headlining her own groundbreaking sitcom that helped redefine what a leading woman on television could be. Van Dyke went on to become one of the defining entertainers of his generation, moving between television, film, and stage for close to 8 decades. Neither career depended on the other. But in interview after interview, both of them kept circling back to those 5 years together as some of the most formative of their working lives. That's the real legacy here, more than any rumor about a hidden romance. Two performers who elevated each other, who pushed each other creatively, and who developed genuine affection for one another along the way. Viewers discovering the show today tend to come away with the same impression audiences had in the 1960s. The relationship simply feels authentic. That authenticity is part of why the show has never really gone out of style. When Van Dyke talks about Moore now, at 100 years old, he isn't performing nostalgia for an audience. He's talking about someone who was there at the beginning of everything he became, someone who shared the kind of professional chemistry most performers spend an entire career chasing and rarely ever find. Careers like his tend to get remembered in fragments. A famous film here, an award there, a clip that resurfaces online every so often. But the through line connecting nearly every retrospective and every birthday tribute is still the 5 years he spent working alongside Mary Tyler Moore. This was never a scandal. It was never a secret affair. It was two people who cared about each other deeply, who stayed loyal to the people they had committed to, and who built a friendship that outlasted the show, outlasted their marriages to other people, and has now outlasted even Mary Tyler Moore's own life by nearly a decade. More than 60 years after they first walked onto that set together, one of them is still telling the story, still crediting her, still choosing to keep her memory part of how he talks about his own life. That's a far better ending than any manufactured headline could ever give you. If you enjoyed this look back at one of television's most genuine partnerships, consider subscribing because there are more stories like this one coming. And let us know in the comments which classic TV pairing you'd like to see covered next.